Hey folks, Dr. Shores here. This will be part one of my mini lecture on saints in early medieval England. So without further ado, let me just launch this. Today I'm going to talk to you about stories of the sea. They will not be tales of long-haul journeys or voyages to distant lands. They will be stories of punting and rafting, and occasional storm near the shore. The figures of these stories are 7th and 8th century monks who were shown to be far more involved in the world than they wanted to be, or that we give them credit for. The sources for these stories are called vitae, Latin for lives. The lives of saints, as they're called, are basically biographies of holy people, and called thusly hagiographies. The authors of the works I'll talk about today are named Bede, who is sometimes called the Venerable Bede, and is the same author. Well, never mind about that. Bede was a prolific author beyond the life of St. Cuthbert, which he based on an earlier anonymous version, and is responsible for much of the history of Anglo-Saxon England that we have today. Of Felix, the author of the Life of St. Guthlac, and Latin Vita Sancti Guthlaci, nothing is known of him beyond what we can glean from this single work. Okay, these two are prime examples of people whose lives I think are misunderstood by those who think that the medieval monk was a man of somber resistance to the world, or even hypocritical condemnation of it. In their holy biographies, though, Bede and Felix show that these holy men, who eventually die as island hermits, as participating in the world that around them in really powerful ways. Both authors then bring these monks out of the scriptorium and, in the case of this presentation, down to the shore, where they engage in nautical experiences that connect them to the people and the sea that surround them. Before we get too far into the saints, I want to share a little bit about the nautical nature of, quote, Anglo-Saxon England, early medieval England, to orient you and to do away with the misconceptions that have hindered our understandings of people who lived about 3 times closer to Jesus than to us. Here's a little timeline just about Cuthbert and his time at Lindisfarne. It's another timeline. Some of you may have seen the image of the famous Sutton Hoo helmet with zoomorphic figures rising over its brows to evoke martial or preternatural power. By now, it's become an icon of early medieval England, a representative not only of the other high-status cosmopolitan luxury goods with which it was found, but also of an increasingly outdated view that only glimmer and gilt are visible through the darkness of the early Middle Ages. The helmet was found in a ship burial. A 90-foot, clinker-built, seaworthy vessel had held the elaborate funeral chamber 1,400 years by the time it was excavated just moments before the outbreak of the Second World War. Many of us have seen this enigmatic photo of the 1939 excavation, but we might easily forget that we are not looking at the wooden remains of a ship. Actually, the image captures the miraculous imprint of it, embossed in the sand and studded by the remaining iron rivets that, when discovered, fastened only dirt to dirt. Made famous by its immense and certainly invaluable treasure, this burial discovery cast a long shadow that continues to obscure other boat finds of Great Britain, including the smaller burial ship just 200 meters away. Half the length of the boat in Mound 1, that in Mound 2 was actually placed on top of the funerary coffer rather than below it. And although most of the grave goods were stolen before the modern discovery, a few remaining suggest that the person buried below was, like the man of Mound 2, a member of the ruling elite. But a recent study has shown that in the same century, considerably more modest inhabitants of Kent were buried with ship strakes, suggesting that in the 7th and 8th centuries, boats and ships were understood by many, not just the elite, to have representational meanings. Along the rocky northern coasts and the soggy East Anglian fens, small watercraft were vital to the establishment and maintenance of monasteries in their nearby villages. As we see in both these vitae, boats were as necessary to practical life as they were to spiritual sustenance. Oh, that's Mound 2. In Chapter 3 of the Vita Cuthberti, that's the Life of St. Cuthbert, Bede departs from his source to invent an entirely unique episode for Cuthbert's very first miracle. He opens his scene in an unnamed monastery on the southern bank near the mouth of the Tyne. He focuses on a group of monks bringing timber eastward along the river by raft. As they approach land, quote, a sudden storm of wind arising from the west dragged their rafts away and began to carry them off towards the mouth of the river. As soon as the monks on land see what has happened, they launch a rescue mission of sorts, but are forced by the winds to return. The work of the would-be rescuers is urgent, and even allowing for 14 centuries of change, a quick glance at the records of time myths suggests that this is likely no embellishment on Bede's part. Writing from Jarrow, which was established 3 decades after this miracle at or never ever or very near this site, Bede might well have witnessed something like this scene with his very own eyes. Whether they were punted or rowed, these rafts would have had no holes to speak of, making them difficult to maneuver and leaving their handlers at the mercy of the elements. Bede's reference of transporting goods on the Tyne suggests a very practical, if even mundane, place that boating held in the lives of monks and their surrounding communities. In the midst of thronging heathen masses, Cuthbert, quote, knelt down to pray to God, bending his head to the ground, and immediately the violent wind turned about and bore the rafts safe and sound to land, amid the rejoicing of those who were guiding them, and left them in a convenient place near the monastery itself. Unquote. In this posture of prayer, he is now the pictorial crux of the scene, becoming the axis around which his audience, the winds, and the monks have now turned. If God speaks to men through their maritime environment, men speak back by nautical exercise. I love the idea that the human and the divine can not only meet face to face, but also speak work for work. Cuthbert, who is not even a monk at this time, is hunched on the ground in the center of a crowd in the middle of a storm. It is here, at his smallest and least visible, that he is shown to be especially close to God. Later, Cuthbert does become a monk, and then becomes a bishop in Lindisfarne, where he lives among many others. But eventually he moves to the tiny island of what we now call Innerfarne, where he lives alone, and he is occasionally visited by boating brethren. Unlike Lindisfarne, Innerfarne is a proper island, in the middle of the sea, that is shut in on the landward side by very deep water, and on the seaward side by boundless ocean. Nevertheless, Innerfarne is far more visible, even if less accessible, than Lindisfarne. In the closing chapters of Bede's work, a monk named Herefrith arrives at Innerfarne to find Cuthbert not as he had anticipated, locked away in his oratory to spend his last moments in quiet contemplation. Instead, Cuthbert had hobbled out of the visitor's dwelling that he had built on the landing place, to be sure that his oncoming visitors would see him. This is one of Bede's most poignant scenes, since it sketches out Cuthbert's insecurities and loneliness on his tiny island. Taking the place of his sailing brethren, he finally embodies the maritime perspective that Bede had constructed around him. This is pretty long so far, so I'll go ahead and stop here, and then I'll do the second part on St. Guthlac in another video. Thanks for watching.